Okay, I played a game this last Wednesday against Arthur in Fitchburg. He had the black pieces, and his rating is a little bit over 1800. I played d4, he played knight f6, c4, e6, and after knight c3, bishop to b4, we've entered an opening known as the Nimzo Indian defense. I played queen to b3. I normally play queen c2, but I had it in my head that after queen b3, black is likely to capture on the c3 square with check. White will respond with queen takes c3, and that'll transpose to what would have happened had I played queen c2 and had black decided to take on c3. Pardon me. I turned out to be wrong about that. As Arthur explained to me after the game, this queen b3 move is worse for white than queen c2 for some reason, but he wasn't able to remember the reason during the game. He played c5. I played knight f3, and he responded with knight c6, at which point e3 is natural, backing up the d4 pawn with another pawn, and defending c4 with a second piece, so that should black decide to play knight a5, forking the queen and the c4 pawn, I don't lose material. If we go back to this position after white plays knight f3, I think this might have been a decent opportunity for black to take away one of white's center pawns by playing the move c takes d4. And it looks pretty dangerous because white can capture this bishop on b4. But black can take a piece as well, the knight on c3, and after queen takes c3, the difference between this and what happened in the game is that white is missing his d-pawn, and therefore has less control of the space in the center of the board. But Arthur decided to play knight to c6, I played e3, and he played knight e4. And his idea here is that the knight on c3 is pinned, so this knight's not actually hanging on e4. And now black is putting extra pressure on it, and should he ever succeed in adding another unit to the attack on the c3 square, or scare away my queen somehow, he'd be able to take on c3 twice and win material. I played bishop to d3, attacking the knight on e4, and Roger chose to play bishop takes c3 check, and he followed that up with the move f5, which is something I've seen with some frequency after black plays a move like knight e4 in this kind of opening. If we go back, I think after the move e3, what I was most worried about during the game, and what I think Arthur should have tried, is the move d5 for black. Matching white's space in the center and on the queen side, and saying to white, okay, demonstrate that you have some kind of an advantage. And black may end up with an isolated pawn as the result of this, as sometimes happens whenever you have this double pawn tension. White may trade on the d5 square at some point, black may take back, and white may take on c5, at which point black has an isolated d-pawn. But an isolated queen pawn is not a disadvantage, necessarily. It depends on how things are played afterwards. Typically, an isolated queen's pawn gives its owner more space and the potential to launch some kind of an attack, usually on the king side, and the defender gets the knowledge that he's playing against an isolated pawn, and therefore that if he can trade off the right sets of pieces, he may eventually be able to force the win of that pawn in some kind of endgame. But if I were black, I would have gone for d5 here, attempting to equalize. Roger played knight e4 instead, and after bishop to d3, perhaps there's another opportunity here to play d5. Again, saying to white, I don't think you have an advantage as long as I equalize the space in the center, so show me what you got. Roger played, not Roger, have I been saying Roger the whole time? This is Arthur. Arthur played bishop takes c3 check. B takes c3. Okay, so black has given up one of his two bishops, leaving white with the two bishops, but has given white a bit of a weakened pawn structure in exchange. And Arthur now played f5, defending the knight on e4. And so we've now got a well-established enough position that we can figure out what the players should be trying to do. I think if I were black, I would have tried at some point to play b6 and bishop to a6, hitting this pawn on c4, and I would have put a knight on a5, also hitting the pawn on c4, and the same thing possibly by moving a knight to d6. Black can pile up a whole bunch of pressure against the c4 pawn, which is a weakness for white, and maybe win it as a result. I castled, and Arthur here made a move that I consider a major strategic error. He played c takes d4, and you'll see that after white's c takes d4, the white pawn structure has now been fixed. There are no more doubled pawns. White clearly has more space in the center, thanks to his pawns on c4 and d4, than does black, whose most advanced pawn is on f5. And more than that, white's pawn center is what I call a mobile center, meaning that there are two pawns right next to each other on the fourth rank from white's point of view, either of which can move forward whenever white wants them to. And that creates both a problem according to a computer for white and a practical problem, because black now has to calculate on every single move what's going to happen if white plays d5 or c5. Arthur played knight to f6, and that's because there was maybe some kind of threat at some point to attack this knight on, to capture this knight on e4, and after f takes e4, maybe to drop the knight back to d2, forcing black to play d5 to defend it, and then maybe, I mean this is kind of complicated, but maybe white would have played f3, beginning to break down the black center and maybe go after the black king. That was a little bit out there, but I hope you followed it. Arthur chose to take on d4, and if we go back to this position, as I said, possibly again here he had the move d5, although that was on the previous move I was looking at it. Okay, so on this move and on the two previous moves, black should at least be considering d5, trying to equalize the space in the center. And as I mentioned earlier, black should be trying to target this pawn on c4. But Arthur traded on d4, and white no longer has a messed up pawn structure. He just has more space and a mobile pawn center and two bishops. And Arthur played knight to f6. Okay, and what often, my experience with the Dutch defense, which is the defense that normally starts d4, f5, is that black can turn out to be very weak when his king's on the king side, thanks to the fact that this f-pawn has moved along the a2 g8 diagonal and the a1 h8 diagonal, because this f-pawn is no longer able to exert control over those diagonals. So if we go back to the game, after black's knight to f6, I want to show somehow as white that black's king side is weak. And I'm a little bit worried that black's going to realize at some point that he should be playing the move d5. And in doing that, he may solidify things in the center and make it difficult for me to attack him. So I decided to play the move d5 myself, preventing him from playing it. Another thing that this does is it displaces the knight on c6, and should black decide to trade a pair of pawns on d5, his f5 pawn becomes a weakness. Arthur responded with knight to a5. Knight to e7, I think, is probably what I would have gone with. But white has ways to continue to put pressure on black after that. For example, d takes e6, d takes e6, rook d1, threatening to reveal an attack on the black queen. Arthur chose knight to a5, and the reason I'm not such a big fan of this move is that even though it comes with tempo, hitting the queen on b3, the knight on a5 has nowhere to move to. So should it be attacked more times than it's defended, black is going to lose some material. I played queen to a4, attacking that knight for the first time, and it's currently defended by the queen, so far there's no problem for black. But after castle kingside, I played bishop to d2. And now this knight on a5 can't escape anywhere, and so must be defended again. And the only way for black to defend that knight is to play b6. But this allows bishop takes a5, b takes a5, after which white isn't up any material, but black has doubled isolated rook pawns on the queen side. And since those are not measurably better than white's isolated rook pawn on a2, white, in effect, has an advantage of one pawn on the center and king side that black doesn't have compensation for. I played rook f to d1. Of course, you want to involve all of your pieces in the game, so the idea here is to activate the rook on the d file. Perhaps at some point I'll take on e6 and then have a revealed attack on the black queen that wins me at least a pawn. And Arthur played d6, which is tempting because black needs some kind of control over the dark squares in the center of the board. If he doesn't get it, this white knight at some point is going to be using those squares as outposts. But he'd also like maybe to activate his bishop on d7 with tempo hitting the queen on a4. Who knows? But the problem is that if he plays d6, white can now play d takes e6. And after bishop takes e6, the pawn structure has changed in such a way that black has an additional isolated pawn on the d-file, which is another target for white. And black has lost the ability to control the d4 square with a pawn. So I played knight to d4. And black will not be able to remove that knight with anything other than his knight on f6 without losing material, but that knight is quite a ways away from challenging the one on d4. Arthur played bishop d7 with tempo. He's got an immediate problem, which is that the knight and light squared bishop for white are attacking the f5 pawn. And the knight on d4 might just trade itself for the bishop on e6, in which case white claims a different kind of advantage, a bishop for knight, with pawns on both sides of the board. So if black just kind of defends the bishop with a move like queen c8, white may trade on e6. And so in order to save the bishop, black has to move it away, but he can't just move it anywhere or he'll lose the pawn on f5. So he moves it to d7 with tempo. But I have this move queen a3, another move with tempo, and you sometimes see this in a chess game between reasonable players. They trade tempo moves back and forth until one person runs out of moves he can make with tempo. And that's what happened to Arthur here. White is now attacking the f5 pawn twice, and attacking the d6 pawn is going to try to win one of them. Arthur chose to play knight e8, which technically defends the d6 pawn against the queen's attack, and it defends the f5 pawn a second time against the bishop on d3 and the knight on d4. But knight e8 is a very passive move, meaning that it puts black's pieces on defense. It protects things in the short term, but it has the long-term weakness that white's going to end up with more active pieces and therefore be the one who is more likely to have favorable tactics. I played rook ab1, involving the last piece in the game. Arthur played f4, looking for counterplay. Seems reasonable to me. He'd love to get this rook on f8 lined up against the f2 square. Bishop to e4, hitting this rook on a8, and also maybe going to d5 with check at some point in the future, which is a move black, at least as things stand right now, will not be able to respond to with anything other than king h8. Arthur played f takes e3, and here we have kind of a question for white. First things first, I don't think white should take the rook on a8. Maybe a computer would be fine with this, but it makes me nervous to look at e takes f2, and then, for example, king f1, maybe king h1 is better, king f1, and queen h4, when the black queen is threatening to cause problems for white, and should white try to defend that with h3, there may be a sacrifice, or maybe the black queen will just wiggle her way in through g3 and h2. So I don't really want to allow black to take on f2. And that suggests the moves queen takes e3 and f takes e3. But there's another move here, which is bishop to d5 check, which comes with tempo, of course. In which case the black king will go to h8, and then I can decide what to do about the e3 pawn. I ended up making the decision by deciding that there might be a point in the future at which this check, let's get rid of some of these lines, this check along the a2 g8 diagonal is more useful than it is right now. So I just played the move queen takes e3. F takes e3 would support the knight on d4 on that very nice outpost, but it would create another weakness for black to target at some point in the future. As things stand after queen takes e3, black has major weaknesses on the queen side and in the center that white can target, and white only has 2 pawns he has to worry about, and they're not currently under attack by black. Why give black another target if you don't have to? And this knight on d4, despite the fact that it's not defended by a pawn, is going to be very difficult for black to do anything about. Again, the only piece which can present a challenge to that knight without costing black material is the knight on e8, which is not very close to being able to do that. Arthur played knight to f6, hitting this bishop on e4 and sacrificing an exchange on a8. He can move the rook out of the way, for example with rook c8. Yeah, and then I'll have moves like bishop d5 check or bishop b7, hitting the rook on c8, followed by something else, or maybe bishop d5 check and knight e6. Maybe bishop b7, scaring the rook away to b8, for example, and then maybe the move knight c6, although that may not be very good. Anyway, there are all sorts of ways for white to proceed and try to take advantage of the fact that he has better pieces at this point. Arthur chose to try to play more actively with knight to f6, reactivating the knight, but sacrificing an exchange on the a8 square. And I want to show you something, which is that if we go back a number of moves, I explained that white having more space and a mobile pawn center, meaning that at any point he could play d5 or c5, gave him at that point a pretty significant advantage. And what we saw in the game after that is that, again, if we go a number of moves ahead, that extra space and mobile pawn center was transformed to active pieces into active pieces in the center of the board. White no longer has as much of a center. He only has his c4 pawn left, which technically gives him more space than the pawn on d6 gives black. But what white really has going for him now is the fact that the queen on e3, the knight on d4, and the bishop on e4 are all centrally placed. And the rooks on b1 and d1 are very active as well. Whereas black's pieces are all stuck on the first and second rank from his point of view. And you see this sometimes. Actually, I'll give another example just to drive it home. There's a certain opening that's thought to be not very good for black, which I've talked a little bit about in the past, called the Marshall defense. It can be reached after d4, knight f6, c4, d5, or d4, d5, c4, knight f6, or any other variation like that. White takes on d5, and after knight takes d5, the problem for black is that when white eventually plays e4, there's no knight on c3 to trade the knight on d5 for, which means this is kind of a worse version of, what's it called? Oh no, I'm forgetting the name. I play it too. This defense, d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5. Can't believe Fiddler plays this. What's it called? Ah, I forgot. Anyway, after c takes d5, e takes d5. In this opening, when white plays e4, black will have will be able to mitigate to some degree white's space advantage by trading a pair of minor pieces. But in the Marshall, the Grunfeld, that's the name. In the Marshall, after c takes d5, knight takes d5, white plays knight f3. And when white eventually plays e4, there's nothing on c3 for black to trade his knight on d5 for, which means all 4 pairs of minor pieces remain on the board, which means white's space advantage is more of an advantage than it would be otherwise. And I wanted to show you this move, because one of my students had at least one game against a player who plays this Marshall defense. And that player played knight c6 here. And after e4, knight to b6, if you put this position into a computer, the computer recommends immediately playing d5, which kind of looks like an overextension. But the computer's idea is that even if black eventually breaks down the white center with the moves c6 and e6, the resulting position will be one in which white's pieces are swarming around the middle of the board, and black's pieces are not very active. Check with a computer if you want more information on that. But the reason I bring that up is it's the same pattern we saw in this game between Arthur and me. White ends up with mobile center pawns and more space, and eventually those pawns are advanced in such a way that the resulting trades leave white with not much of a center, but very active pieces in the center. And that's the kind of transformation you're looking for when you have extra space in a mobile pawn center. Okay, as I said, Arthur decided to sack an exchange with knight f6. I played bishop takes a8. In this sort of situation, if you can't see that your opponent has sufficient compensation for the exchange, you're, I don't know, chessically, ethically obligated to take the material. So I did bishop takes a8, queen takes a8, and now we have to kind of change our approach to the game. Before we were looking to just, I was just looking to improve my pieces and to take space and to make sure my king is safe. But now I'm up material, which means if I can make my way to an endgame, I'm very likely going to be winning the game. And if I can trade all the way into a rook versus minor piece endgame, the position should be very easily winning for me because of the vast amount of open space for the rook to travel around on and the fact that there are pawns on both sides of the board. Okay, so I just showed you that I played f3, but we have to find, once you're up material, your mindset should sort of switch from the normal things to figuring out how to consolidate your position so that you can eliminate your opponent's counterplay, at which point you can start the process of trading pieces and heading for a winning endgame. What does black have here that's a threat? Not much. Black would like to line up his light-squared bishop and queen against the g2 square, but should he ever play bishop to c6, that bishop can be traded off with knight takes c6, and the bishop showing up on c6 isn't much of a threat anyway. It's just a threat to capture a pawn on g2. So black has at his disposal only one threat, as far as I can see, and that is to play knight g4, forking the queen and the pawn on f2, and coordinating with the rook from f8, at which point he'll win a pawn. And so I had to eliminate that somehow, and I played the move f3. This kind of kingside pawn move in front of your king, when as a defensive measure to avoid having your opponent follow through with whatever threats he has at the moment, is usually not something that's recommended. But here I think is an exception, because this knight on d4 is very powerful and very difficult for black to challenge, and it's guarding the f3 square, making some kind of sacrifice of the light-squared bishop for white's kingside light-squared pawns not very likely. Arthur played queen to c8, targeting this weakness on c4. It's what you're supposed to do. And I played knight to b5. At this point, white has very active heavy pieces, and two of those pieces are x-raying black weaknesses. So I moved the knight out of the way, turning those x-ray attacks into direct attacks, and offering black the opportunity to take the pawn on c4 in exchange for the pawn on d6, which would create more space for the white rooks to move around on, which tends to favor them. I think the right way to think about it is that the more open space there is on the board, the more favorable it is for the most powerful pieces. So queens like it the most, and rooks like it the second most. Arthur played rook to e8 instead of queen takes c4. Okay, my queen is under attack, and she's attacking one of black's weaknesses, so queen takes a7 is a natural move for white. I was a little bit worried about black playing rook e2 here, looking for counterplay, but luckily it turns out that the rook is pretty much attacking by itself in that case, and after rook e2, knight takes d6, the queen on c8 is under attack, white may play rook b8 next, and there isn't a good way for black to provide assistance to the rook on e2, which isn't going to be able to do very much by itself. Instead, Roger played bishop takes b5, but this decision is, it leaves black in a position which is practically untenable. And that's because without the light-squared bishop, there's no real hope of a sacrifice on white's king side that'll lead to the opening of white's king position and hopefully a perpetual or even a checkmating attack. And when another pair of minor pieces leaves the board, that creates more open space on the board, which tends to favor the most powerful pieces. And since white has a rook for a knight, it favors white. But it gives up. Actually, let's step back for a second. After bishop takes b5, I can take back with either the c-pawn or the rook. Taking back with the c-pawn protects the c-pawn, But taking back with the rook makes it so that after Arthur's queen takes c4, I can trade more material with rook b8, heading again for an easily winning endgame. Arthur played queen to e2, looking for counterplay, and making a move that, if responded to incorrectly, will get black back in the game. If I fail to protect the rook on d1, he can take it, and if I protect it by taking on d6, which would be a terrible mistake, he can play queen to e1 checkmate. But I took on e8 with check instead, and now if Arthur takes back with the queen, he's no longer even attacking the pawn on a2, and for that reason the game is not a very difficult one for white to win. So he plays knight takes e8, but now after queen to d4, the rook is protected, the king can't be checked, and if white grabs this pawn on a2, which Arthur did in the game, I have queen d5 check, forcing the trade of queens. And Arthur resigned at this point, but had he traded queens, this a pawn would be indefensible. For example, a4, rook to a5. So again, Arthur resigned here after queen d5, but it was a very good game. And he mentioned by email that he'd like my thoughts on it, so I thought it'd be a good one to make a video about. And there were a couple of, I guess, main points that he might benefit from thinking about. One of them is, let's go back to the beginning of the game. In this position, perhaps black should have played c takes d4. It works out tactically because even though the bishop on b4 is undefended, the knight on c3 is also attacked. It would have been an opportunity to eliminate one of white's center pawns. Another thing is that this move c takes d4 was not very strong. It fixes white's problems for him and leaves him with what I've been describing as a mobile pawn center and more space. And this mobile pawn center can eventually be transformed into a position in which the center is largely gone, but white has very active pieces in the center, and black's pieces are stuck on his back two ranks. So Arthur, I hope you found it helpful, and I hope everyone else did too, and thanks for watching.